A truly legendary handgun, the M1911 is widely considered the greatest semi-automatic pistol ever made and the grandfather of the modern handgun. In the early 20th century, the U.S. military was conducting trials of several self-loading pistol designs, including the M1900, which was the first handgun to utilize short recoil operation. The trials continued for several years. The M1900 gradually evolved, and more of the competition fell away. During testing in 1910, the design that was to become the M1911 swept away the final competitor. Over the course of 2 days, the M1911 fired 6,000 rounds from a single pistol, and when it grew hot, it was simply cooled off in water. It became the first self-loading pistol that passed with a 100% grade, leading it to being adopted by the U.S. Army early the following year, and then by the Navy and Marine Corps in 1913. It was with the U.S. entry into World War I that the M1911 saw large-scale action for the first time, where its reliability and powerful .45 caliber bullet earned it the nickname the Man-Stopper. Patton was a captain in World War I and carried an M1911 with ivory grips engraved with his initials. The Sergeant York famously used the M1911 during his heroic acts at Meuse-Argonne. Multiple nations have used the pistols, including the Royal Navy, France, and Canadian officers in World War I. The M1911 remained the standard issue sidearm for U.S. forces up until 1986, when it was replaced, but even to this day, some special forces still use it. In the early 20th century, interest in tiny guns as easily concealable personal protection weapons, and many different models were being sold. The .25 ACP round was invented in 1905 with the express purpose of being used in small pocket pistols. During a time when most criminals were armed with melee weapons, even a tiny handgun would be an advantage. The smallest automatic pistol ever was designed by an Austrian watchmaker who wanted to make an ultra-concealable handgun. For this purpose, he developed the smallest centerfire cartridge ever, the 2.7mm Colibri round. Colibri is German for hummingbird, and patented it in 1910. And then he proceeded to design a new semi-automatic pistol for the round, resulting in a 2.7 Grabner Selbstlader pistol that was less than 3 inches long, using the same blowback mechanism as many modern small caliber guns, and with a detachable 6-round box magazine. The 2.7mm Colibri round was very weak and could even bounce off thick clothing, but could be dangerous or at least deterring if fired at the face, and the recoil was virtually non-existent. About 1,000 of these pistols were manufactured until World War I put a halt to production in 1914. Most of these were lost or destroyed in the chaos of the world wars that followed, but a few were picked up by soldiers as souvenirs and have been kept until this day. One of the earliest and most successful light machine guns, the Lewis gun, was designed in the U.S. in 1911, but at first failed to garner interest in America. Instead, the designer went overseas in 1913, where the Belgian army quickly saw its benefits and placed orders for it. Soon after, it began to be produced in the UK and was adopted as a standard British Army machine gun in late 1950. The gun was also supplied to Russia and purchased or captured by many nations. The Lewis gun is unusual and iconic with its rifle-style butt and pistol grip, round pan magazine, and long metallic cooling jacket over the barrel. This was meant to increase cooling of the weapon by pulling air past the barrel when firing. The flat pan magazine had no springer for feeding cartridges into the gun, and were instead powered by the action of the gun itself. Unusually, the Lewis gun also had an adjustable clock-type recoil spring, which allowed the rate of fire of the weapon to be adjusted. It was called the Belgian Rattlesnake by the Germans that came up against it in 1914. And already by 1916, about 50,000 Lewis guns had been produced, and the weapon was being extensively used at sea, in the air, and in armored vehicles. When deployed in aircraft, the Lewis gun typically had the cooling jacket removed and a taller 97-round pan magazine. It was an expensive weapon to produce for its time, but was considered one of the best and most reliable LMGs and went on to see action in World War II and beyond. The legendary BAR M1918 was America's answer to the light portable machine rifles of World War I. When the U.S. entered the war, it had far too few machine guns, so the War Office requested native designs. In early 1917, the BAR was demonstrated and was so impressive that the government immediately awarded it a contract. Tens of thousands of M1918s were ordered, but most of America's gun manufacturers were already very busy producing other arms and materials for the Allies, leading to delays in production. By July 1918, the BAR had started to appear in France, and it was used extensively in the Meuse-Argonne offensive in September. The war was drawing to a close, but the BAR had made a huge impression on the Allies, and they, too, ordered it in great numbers. Similar to other light machine guns of the time, the M1918 was intended to provide fire support during an assault by being fired from the shoulder or the hip, called walking fire at the time. There was even a special belt for the BAR, where the shoulder stock could rest on in a holder on the hip. Although an impressive weapon in many ways, the M1918 was considered too heavy for an automatic rifle, having a magazine capacity that was too small for it to be an effective squad support weapon. Nevertheless, it was officially adopted in 1938 and went on to serve in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The French M1909 Benet Massey was one of the earliest truly light machine guns. It was developed in 1907 and based on the standard French heavy machine gun, which had been lightened significantly. It was adopted by a multitude of nations, including the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the British Empire, the USA, Belgium, Spain, Taiwan, and Sweden. The Benet Massey had only 25 major components, and the modern feature that a damaged or overheated barrel could be replaced quickly. It was a machine rifle designed with wooden buttstock, pistol grip, bipod, and sometimes the addition of telescopic sights and butt monopod. It used unusual rigid metal strips that fed rounds horizontally. The M1909 was also used extensively as aircraft machine guns and as a secondary armament in tanks. In this case, the butt was removed and the weapons were modified to feed from regular belts. And as a little side note, I believe that the Benet Massey was also called the Hotchkiss machine gun. I'm not entirely sure, don't quote me on that. The British SMLE, or short magazine, The British SMLE rifle is one of the longest serving military rifles ever, having been adopted in 1895 and remaining the standard service rifle until 1957. As a sniper rifle, the SMLE stayed in official service until small magazine Lee-Enfield, till the 1990s. And even today is still the standard rifle in some nations. The legendary Mark III version was introduced in 1907 and served through World War I. Sometimes pronounced smelly, it was a smooth and quick bolt action. Together with the unusual feature of a detachable 10-round magazine, it allowed a well-trained rifleman to perform the Mad Minute, firing 20 to 30 aimed rounds in 60 seconds. In 1914, a British musketry instructor set the current world record for aimed bolt-action fire, placing 38 rounds into a 300mm wide target at 270 meters in 1 minute. This action and training led to German troops sometimes believing they were facing machine gun fire, when in fact they were repelled by a group of riflemen with SMLEs. Again, SMLE means short magazine Lee-Enfield. The iconic American shotgun was designed in 1897, and its improved pump slide action made it popular with hunters and law enforcement from the outset. But it was with the United States' entry into World War I that sales of the M1897 really picked up to meet the demands of the U.S. Armed Forces. The military had observed the war in France and understood the brutality of trench warfare and the need for an effective close combat weapon. The original design was modified by adding a perforated steel heat shield over the barrel with a bayonet lug. Because of the lack of a trigger disconnector, the M1897 fires each time the user cycles the pump action while the trigger is depressed. This feature earned it the nickname Trench Sweeper among the troops. And the name for the action is called Slam Fire, because as soon as you slam the pump forward, fire. Another legendary use of the shotgun was trap shooting at enemy grenades in midair, deflecting them from the American trenches. The shotgun was so effective and feared in the hands of the Americans that the German government protested and wanted the weapon outlawed, to no avail. From 1897 to 1957, over 1 million shotguns of this model were produced. During the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the German army came up against the Lewis gun in great numbers and realized that they lacked a similar weapon. As they only had some Madsons and the MG08-15 had not yet been fielded, the original MG-15 was a heavy water-cooled machine gun that had not seen much use. But in early 1916 it was redesigned with the MG-15NA, which stands for Neue Art, or new model. The receiver had been lightened and a rifle-style buttstock, a pistol grip, and trigger grouping were added. And a thin, perforated, air-cooled barrel replaced the heavy water-cooled one. It also received a carrying handle, new sights, and a light bipod. The MG-15NA was fielded in 1916 and with a much lighter machine gun than the water-cooled MG08-15 that had later become Germany's primary LMG. The MG-15NA was closer to the Lewis gun in role, although considered less reliable and intended as more of a short-range LMG. It was used in great numbers during the war, also as an aircraft machine gun, but it was used primarily by the German Agent Corps in the Eastern and Palestinian fronts, and special Lichtmaschinengewehr Truppen were formed around the weapon. It was, however, always in the shadow of the more famous and widely used MG08-15, and the MG-NA was out of service and largely forgotten by World War II. One of the most famous German firearms ever, the P08 was an evolution of the C93 pistol from 1893. The C93 was accurate and powerful, but had awkward ergonomics and was expensive to manufacture. After the designer of the C93 refused to make the requested design changes to the gun, the job was given to his former assistant. The C93 used a complex toggle lock action that was a big part of the pistol's problems, so it was simplified and the weapon was made more compact, given better ergonomics. This design, called the Parabellum pistol, was patented in 1898. The Swiss were the first to purchase the Parabellum in 1900. Many nations bought it before World War I. Even the USA considered the pistol before they settled on the M1911, but it was when the German army adopted the Parabellum in 1908 to replace the Reichsrevolver that it got the P08 designation. It was the standard issue sidearm of German forces through World War I until 1938, with 2 million pistols produced by 1942. The P08 received a reputation for durability and accuracy, although its mechanism was still highly complex and expensive, but the build quality of early P08s was so good that pistols which saw service in World War I lasted well through World War II and beyond. Like with many other pistols in World War I, there were experiments with converting the P08 into a fully automatic machine pistol, but it had an excessive rate of fire and the idea was abandoned. It began in times of war, where the bayonet fixed to the tip of the rifle was a symbol for how close combat was supposed to be fought. Reality proved a different story. As war pulled enemies closer to one another, often in tight spaces like trenches, new tools for close quarters were needed. As most armies faced a shortage of pistols, two of mankind's most primitive killing tools came into play: the club and the knife. A return to medieval combat. Complemented by sharpened shovels, these basic weapons suit the nature of trench warfare. Soldiers involved in trench raids abandoned the rifle and bayonet in favor of the pistol in trench club combo. This is where the First World War starts to look more like a mix of medieval warfare than a modern war. Improvised trench clothes studded with nails or wire spikes, morning stars, and knuckle duster knives saw the light in a new type of gruesome close combat, reminiscent of wars of centuries past. Grenades came in many shapes and forms. Discs, potato-shaped, cylinders attached to sticks. Some were even fired from rifles, but the hand grenade became the most popular version. Special units of grenadiers were formed during the war and would be responsible for quickly racing down trenches and dugouts and wreaking havoc. Grenades proved extremely effective for clearing out pillboxes and straw points. Hand grenades, which contained poisonous gas, were also developed. 15,000 grenades during one night. During a clash on the Poitiers Heights in 1916, British and Australian soldiers were involved in the biggest grenade fight of the war with German soldiers. The British and Australian soldiers threw some 15,000 grenades in one night. Mortars came in various different sizes in World War I and were widely used by all belligerents. Sizes ranged from small portable mortars to big siege mortars that had a range exceeding 2,000 meters. Mortars had the advantage that they could be fired from the relative safety of a trench, unlike artillery. A mortar projectile followed a vertical trajectory, and because it came down almost directly above its target, it was especially effective at reaching strong points in the enemy trenches. As with everything else in World War I, started off relatively underused. As an example, the French initially used Coehorn mortars from the Napoleonic Wars 100 years earlier, but by the end of the war, designs had developed into advanced mortars that continued to be used in the next World War. We might think of World War I as being a war of big armies moving according to an old plan that would never work, and that nobody did anything to change that. But nothing could be further from the truth. Alpine hunters, shock troops, strike/grenadier battalions, and many other types of units fought with uniquely developed tactics for special strikes both in the trenches and beyond. It was a new, aggressive combat style. With the French Blue Devils, the Italian Ardites, and the German stormtroopers using radical Houthi infiltration tactics. A new aggressive combat style saw the light of day during the Great War. This revolutionary approach to warfare was a clear departure from the costly practice of using mass infantry for frontal assaults. Stormtrooper attacks usually began with a smaller but violent artillery barrage concentrated on a smaller point rather than a wide front, after which the stormtroopers did a rapid assault across no man's land, taking key positions and continuing beyond the trench lines to create confusion and paralyze the enemy in the rear. In many cases, this was then followed up by regular infantry sent forward to secure the captured territory. During the course of the war, a need for smaller portable guns that could engage strong points, bunkers, and even vehicles grew. Sometimes these mini-cannons came equipped with a shield, and their caliber could be as big as 37 millimeters, which provided incredible power with armor penetration capabilities. But this came at the price of low mobility and cumbersome handling. Small portable flamethrower introduced in 1917. It had a donut-shaped backpack fuel container. Flamethrowers were used even in the early stages of the Great War and spread terror amongst the soldiers. They had a limited range, but they were effective for clearing out forward positions and dugouts preceding infantry attacks. By the end of the war, their use had been extended to an anti-tank role as well. The hands of the right soldier is one of the deadliest weapons in Battlefield 1. Germany was one of the first buyers and strongest believers in the new Maxim machine guns at the end of the 19th century, and soon they began producing their own version. They developed and lightened the design, leading to ultimately to the MG08 in 1908, which would be Germany's standard machine gun at the outbreak of World War I and widely used during the war. The MG08 had a very heavy was a very heavy weapon with a large mount, intended for stationary defense use. In 1915, as the need for more mobile firepower increased and German troops came up against much lighter automatic weapons at the Allied side, it was decided to modify the MG08 into a lighter and more portable weapon manned by a four-man crew in prone position. The new weapon would still be water-cooled, but the water jacket was narrowed to contain less water. The receiver of the gun was made from thinner steel and the mechanism was simplified and had its upper part cut down, giving the gun a distinct profile. The receiver backplate, with its spade grips, was replaced with a wooden shoulder stock and a pistol grip, and instead of the heavy MG08 mounts, it got a smaller bipod below the water jacket. The new design also got a mount for a new belt container. The Guts Rommel. I should probably say that I do not know German, so yeah. The new weapon got the designation LMG 0815, the lowercase l, standing for Leicht, or light, while a capital L stands for Luft, aircraft version. Prototypes of the 0815 began testing in 1915. Production began in 1916, and the first 0815s were deployed at Verdun later that year. It became the most common German machine gun in World War I, with 130,000 produced during World War I, and by 1918, there were 4 times as many 0815s as MG08s. At 18 kilograms, the 0815 was heavier than LMGs on the Allied side, but it was designed to be an assault weapon, and training for it included how to properly hold and fire the 0815 on the move to provide suppressing fire. Even 14 years before the war started, the reflector or a reflex sight was invented. This was a non-magnifying optical sight using a collimator in which allowed the viewer to see an illuminated reticle. But beyond that, World War I birthed the modern sniper. The battleships with the better optics had an edge in battles over ships with lesser optics. An array of inventions in different optics allowed for soldiers, pilots, and gunners to see further than ever before. The demands on optical glass during the war transformed the entire industry around optical glass from small scale to massive enterprises driven by the needs of the war. Right after the C96 pistol had begun production, the manufacturer began experimenting with true carbine versions of the weapon. One of the ideas was a carbine for light cavalry, the M1896 Cavalier Carabiner. Instead of the detachable stock of the C96 pistol, these had a permanently fixed wooden stock and forend, a much longer barrel, between 300 and 370 millimeters, and the standard 10-round magazine. These carbines were never adopted by a military force. However, they were instead sold as commercial sporting weapons. Around 1,100 such C96 carbines were made before production was canceled in 1899 due to poor interest. Late in World War I, another carbine based on the C96 was produced, the M1917 Trench Carbine, designed to be a light and compact assault weapon for stormtroopers. The biggest difference to the earlier C96 carbines was a detachable 40-round box magazine. A small quantity was produced and issued to stormtroopers, but most of them were destroyed after the Versailles Treaty. By far, the most common carbine version of the C96 was the regular pistol with its detachable shoulder stock, which were commonly used as personal defense or assault weapons in World War I. The Nagant 1895 revolver is arguably one of the most well-known handguns in the world. In 1891, the Imperial Russian Army adopted the equally famous Mosin Nagant service rifle, incorporating design features of the Belgian weapon designer Leon Nagant, which had made Leon and his brother Emil well known in Russian Tsarist and military circles. After the adoption of the Mosin Nagant rifle, the Tsar requested a modern sidearm for officers and troops, and in 1895 the Russian army adopted the Nagant brothers' revolver. In a twist of fate, 7 of the Nagant revolvers would be used to murder the Tsar and his family in 1918. Designed between the late 1880s and early 1890s, the Nagant revolver is virtually unique in that it utilizes a gas-tight seal. Most revolvers have a small gap between the cylinder and the barrel, allowing the cylinder to rotate, leading to some of the propellant gases escaping through the gap and lowering the muzzle velocity. The cylinder of the M1895 instead slides forward a little upon cocking, sealing the cylinder against the barrel forcing cone. The gun also used a proprietary 7.62 by 39mm rimmed cartridge, with the bullet enclosed inside the casing, and a climp just above the bullet which expands into the forcing cone upon firing. These two features of the M1895 extracts the maximum energy from the propellant gases, increasing the muzzle velocity to 891 feet per second, or 272 meters per second. The gas-tight seal also allowed a sound suppressor to be mounted, which is unusual for revolvers. The biggest downside of this design is that each cartridge has to be loaded and extracted one by one through a loading gate, making the M1895 slower to reload than many contemporary break-action revolvers, which could use speed loaders and eject all spent casing at once. Still, the Nagant revolver served extensively with the Russians through and beyond World War I, and was highly appreciated for its extreme sturdiness and dependability. Even as more modern pistols like the T-33 appeared alongside it, the M1895 kept serving, with over 2 million built when production finally ceased ca 1950. Many other nations also used the Nagant revolver, like Belgium, Kazakhstan, Sweden, Norway, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Ukraine. After World War II, it kept on being used in the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, with some security forces still being equipped with the Nagant 1895 well into the 21st century. The Russian hussars were elite light cavalry, made up of men drawn from the upper and aristocratic classes. Those men sought glory and an honorable reputation as officers in the prestigious hussar regiments. Although the training was harsh and the drill relentless, the hussars offered a family-like structure, with a tradition and history dating back to the 17th century. Intended for breaking formations with a thunderous mounted charge, they were meticulously trained in horsemanship and hand-to-hand combat with lance and saber. In the Russian advance in the summer of 1914, the hussars were often sent on reconnaissance missions far ahead of the infantry. They also guarded their infantry's flanks, screened their maneuvers, and intercepted enemy patrols. Outfitted with carbines and revolvers, they were even able to dismount and fight on foot, but were no match against well-positioned or entrenched infantry. Instead, they fought smaller skirmishes or exploited gaps in the front line with their speed. The nature of the war eventually forced the hussars off their horses and into the trenches, but the regiments maintained their cohesion until the revolution of 1917 broke the tradition of the loyal hussar regiments. Many of their czarist officers vanished in the Red Terror or fought for the White Army, until the Bolshevik victory abolished the old order once and for all. Throughout the war, the navies of the warring nations encountered each other in a variety of scenarios all over the world's seas, and naval warfare was a war of technology and training, where position and speed ultimately decided the outcome of the battle. Fought over great distances, rangefinders and optical equipment had to be expertly used to calibrate the big guns. Admirals would direct ships of different speeds, firepower, and range into optimal positions while judging the strategy of the enemy. The Adriatic Sea saw the dominance of small but agile torpedo boats, while submarines hunted unwary merchant ships in the North Sea. All navies feared the power of a single well-placed torpedo. Cheaply built and easily developed, they were able to land a decisive blow against a more powerful enemy, if they could just get close enough. Far and away in the Pacific, lone German raiders escaped Allied patrols over and over again. wreaking havoc on merchant shipping and attacking undefended coastal ports. Elsewhere, mine layers silently cruised through the night, deploying their deadly traps. In the narrow straits around the Dardanelles, the Black Sea, and the Levant, ships fell prey to the deadly explosives that lurked beneath the surface. One might think that motorcycles were used by dispatch riders and for quick transportation, but motorcycles in World War I saw action on the front line. They were often outfitted with various sidecar-mounted machine guns and fought together in units referred to as motor mobile infantry. Armed sidecars were used to support units of motorcycle-mounted infantry, however was rarely fired from a moving vehicle in action. Firing from a static position was considered blunt. Once the German army had witnessed the effectiveness of the Belgian armored cars at the beginning of the war, they decided to produce their own. These first designs were first sent to the Baltics, and then on to the Western Front. Once there, their mobility was challenged by the terrain, and they were sent off to the Eastern Front in Russia, where their mobility was more effective. This car could reach a top speed of 60 kilometers an hour, and was mostly armed with 3 machine guns. First built by French arms manufacturer FAMH in 1917, the Shah Saint-Chamond was designed with the idea of improvising on the Schneider CA-1 tank. Manned by 8 men and outfitted with a full-length 75mm gun in its front, its main purpose was originally to accompany the French infantry into attack. The front of the tank was protected by 11mm steel armor, the sides by 17mm, and each side also featured a Hotchkiss machine gun. 2 gasoline-electric transmission engines powered each track separately, which was innovative for the time, making the Saint-Chamond much easier to steer than earlier tanks. Despite its weight of 23 tons, it could reach a maximum speed of 12 kilometers an hour over open ground. However, the first versions of the Saint-Chamond failed to be of military value and were very unpopular with the crews because of technical handicaps. The Holt Caterpillar tracks were too short for the tank's length, and the overhanging nose with its big gun made it vulnerable to large shell holes and ditches. The engines were underpowered, and the weight of the tank made the tank sink on muddy ground. Later versions would improve the body armor, widen the tracks, and modify the front gun, but it was still unsuitable for its intended role. Instead, they would be most often used as supply and recovery tanks, or as mobile batteries to combat German field guns near the end of the war. The French Char 2C, or Char de Rupture 2C, or breakthrough tank, first conceived in 1916, remains the largest operational tank ever made, weighing in at around 70 tons. It is also the single operational super heavy tank ever, being rivaled only by the German Tiger II tank of World War II. While highly impressive and influential in tank development, the Char 2C missed its opportunity in history and is today a tank shrouded in mystery. The super heavy tank concept was born out of the unique conditions on the Western Front in World War I. With virtually all belligerents considering enormous vehicles, able to break through the deep defenses and destroy enemy strongholds while being immune to artillery fire. Most are expecting the war to continue into 1919, when these giant tanks would roll alongside masses of smaller vehicles and achieve victory. Some propose designs like the German K-Wagen and the British Flying Elephant would have weighed in excess of 100 tons, with the most extreme concept being the 1,500-ton British Land Dreadnought. Of course, most of these designs never left the drawing board, but the French took the concept of the super heavy tank further than any other. In the summer of 1916, the shipyard FCM in southern France was awarded the contract for the development of what was called the Char d'Assaut de Grand Modèle. But there was competition and argument over which approach to take with the design. And in early 1917, 3 prototypes in which classes were ordered. The 30-ton A version, the 45-ton B version, from the 62-ton C version. The first prototype was built, the FCM-1A, and demonstrated in November 1917 to an impressed crowd. But in early 1918, it was decided to instead go for the heaviest C version, considerably delaying the project by requiring completely new prototypes. And 300 SAR T2s, 2Cs, were ordered from SCM. 10 had been built by the end of World War I, but they never became operational before the armistice. When constructed, the Char 2C was an exceptionally modern tank with many novel features. It had a spacious hull with 2 fighting compartments for its crew of 12, with 2 machine guns on the sides and above the forward compartment, with a revolving main turret with a 75 cannon and a coaxial machine gun. The turret housed 3 men and was placed so high that they had to reach it by a ladder and sat in seats suspended from the turret roof. At the end of the tank was a smaller machine gun turret, and both turrets had stroboscopic cupolas. The 2C's armor was among the thickest of World War I era tanks, with 22mm on the side and 45mm on the front. Each of its tracks were originally powered by a separate 200 horsepower engine via an electrical transmission, giving the massive tank a top speed of 12 kilometers an hour. The hull was 10.27 meters long, 3 meters wide, and just over 4 meters tall. The Char 2C could not be wider in order to allow it to be transported to the front line via rail, which would prove a fatal flaw in the future. After the war, the French interest in costly war material waned, with every Char 2C costing about 20 times as much as an FT light tank. But in 1921, the 10 Char 2Cs were finished and adopted mostly as propaganda tools, France being the only country in the world with operational super heavy tanks. By World War II, the Char 2C had become obsolete against new tank developments, with its slow speed and giant size making a formidable target for modern tank destroyers. When the Germans broke through French lines in 1940, it was decided to send the Char 2C south via rail to prevent their capture. But the train got blocked and the 2Cs were eventually destroyed. One of them had been captured by the Germans intact, however, and was sent back to Berlin. At the end of World War II, the captured 2C disappeared, spawned a myth about it still existing somewhere in Russia. In production since March 1915 by the Putilov Armament Works, this armored car was designed to fit on a chassis built by the Garford Motor Truck Company. It was armed with a single 76.2 mountain gun on the front and a 7.62 Maxim machine gun on each side. With armor up to 6.5 millimeters thick, the cars provided good cover against small arms fire and were agile enough to act as mobile support batteries. However, the underpowered 4-cylinder 30 horsepower engine allowed for speeds of only 10 miles per hour, or 16 kilometers an hour, since its weight of 8.5 tons dragged it down. Still, it was very popular because of its shock factor and firepower. 48 were built in total, and they saw service all over the Eastern Front. Some being captured by the Germans, Poles, and various Baltic factions that would see further action in post-war struggles. Flare guns were single-shot brass guns carried by assault teams, sentries, and pilots. The combustion of different chemical ingredients with a fuel source like magnesium would be fired into the air, with small cartridges would burn out in a set color. During an assault, soldiers would shoot up a flare to signal their commanders that they had successfully reached an objective or infiltrated a trench. Flares were used by pilots to point out strong points and valuable targets for their artillery. They were also used by sentries when spotting movement during the night. Once brightly illuminated, men sneaking through the battlefield suddenly became big targets. By 1918, trench raiding squads emerged on all sides, but the German High Command began to experiment with specialized assault teams on a larger scale. The Rohr Battalion was the first to combine light infantry and pioneer groups to break through the enemy's defenses in a swift and concentrated attack and to create a gap for the regular infantry. But the real birthplace of the shock troops was the Russian summer offensive of 1916. It was Russian General Alexei Brusilov who timed concentrated artillery barrages with aggressive infantry attacks to break the Austrian lines. Soon the Germans created what they call Sturmtruppen, or stormtroopers, highly motivated, extremely aggressive, and expertly trained in all kinds of weapons. They carried grenades, flamethrowers, and submachine guns, overwhelming defenders through shock and brutality. As the war began, soldiers on all sides marched in densely packed formations over open ground, only to become prey to overpowering modern weaponry like machine guns. Contrary to popular belief, many military thinkers quickly realized that tactics had to change. Combat patrols and trench raiders soon began to experiment with the idea of decentralized leadership, giving the NCOs and low-ranking officers the chance to lead from the front and to react to quickly changing situations. This new flexibility soon altered the way infantry moved into combat, as smaller but highly specialized assault troops emerged from the training camps with names like Stormtroopers, RD, or Jägerkommando. Different teams and weapon groups had to closely interact with each other to maximize their effectiveness. Pioneers would cut gaps in enemy barbed wire, and mobile field mortar teams and machine gunners would open up, providing support and pinning down the surprise defenders. Rifle grenades whistled into the trenches, and flamethrowers blazed into the dugouts as the heavily armed shock infantry jumped into the lines and onto their enemies. Fighting in the close quarters of the trenches turned into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Instead of the cumbersome bayonet, the soldiers hacked and stabbed at each other with knives, sharpened spades, clubs, and brass knuckles. Dozens of hand grenades exploded within moments, creating a storm of shrapnel. By the final battles of the war, the new breed of professional soldiers were the Stars, driving a wedge through the enemy's defensive lines. Behind thick belts of sandbags, barbed wire, and metal sheets, soldiers watched each other cross no man's land with careful eyes. In quiet times, trench warfare was a war of attrition and harassment. Snipers and camouflaged marksmen were in constant search of negligent soldiers who held their heads too long above the parapets. Some forward trenches were only a short distance away from each other, and soldiers bombarded each other with explosives thrown by small catapults or fired by trench mortars and mine throwers. The German trenches were particularly sophisticated, reinforced with deep dugouts and cement bunkers. They were secure shelters for their infantry against the heavy shelling of their enemies. Built in narrow zigzag formations to protect against shrapnel and incoming grenades, reserve and communication trenches connected machine gun emplacements and grenade pillboxes with each other. When the front became active, so too did life in the trenches. Some light artillery barrages usually meant a coming attack, and the defenders would hurry out of the dugouts and bunkers as soon as the shelling stopped, and bring up machine guns and rifles. Brutal close combat followed if the attacker managed to break into the lines. Without room to maneuver, soldiers had to step over the mutilated corpses of their dead and wounded. The zigzag lines now provided enough cover for close quarters, rifle fire, and grenades, and whole squads were killed in moments by storms of steel that raged in the narrow earthworks. The staggering and unprecedented casualties of the first months of the war made it clear that the era of the mass infantry charge over open ground was definitely over. New tactics of trench warfare had to be established and taught to combat the strong German offensive. While organization into battalions continued, it was a smaller fighting group of around 20 men led into combat by a junior officer that was now most effective in frontline combat. The French army helped the strongest artillery force, fielded the strongest artillery force of the war, and with the invention of the creeping barrage, it was able to allow specialized assault squads to advance behind a curtain of shells and breach the German positions. A new form of column tactic was also introduced that allowed for a more concentrated attack. Positions that were taken were immediately fortified against potential counterattacks, and nettoyer de tranche groups, heavily supplied with grenades, would be sent out to deal with nests of resistance. The concept of walking fire was introduced, and every squad was outfitted with at least one shell-shot light machine gun to provide suppressing fire. What do I need for this? Okay.
Despite the 1899 Hague Convention Treaty that banned the military use of poison gases, all major combatants of the war used them at one point or another. Tear gas, chlorine gas, phosgene gas, or the dreaded mustard gas. As the war went on, the chemicals grew even more dastardly. The horrors of chemical warfare caused worldwide public indignation that continued long after the war. In actual fact, chemical weapons were relatively ineffective. Just 3% of those who suffered a gas attack died, but the effects to the eyes and lungs were often long-lasting. It was the families of the victims sent home, who watched their loved ones slowly and painfully die over weeks and months, who were the hardest hit.
And if you're curious as to how mustard gas worked, basically it was chlorine gas that once it entered your lungs, it would essentially turn into a liquid and basically drown you from the inside out. So it worked more on a, so it was kind of more of an, like an attrition style. Razor sharp shrapnel, rocks and debris, explosives and bullets made sure that nearly no soldier who went over the top came back completely unharmed, and many collapsed in no man's land. Stretcher bearers would carry the soldiers back to the trenches. Regimental medical officers, also known as combat medics, were able to treat the wounded during the stress of battle. In narrow trenches, they tried to keep the soldier alive, all the while enduring artillery fire and the desperate screams of their patients. They stabilized the wounded as the battle raged and gave them shots of disinfectant to help them live long enough to be transported out of the trenches and towards a dressing station. There they were examined, and if the case wasn't hopeless, an ambulance took them to a casualty clearing station behind the lines. Nothing was scarier than lying bleeding and barely breathing in no man's land. Your comrade would hurriedly pull out the small waterproof sealed first aid kit that was kept in a jacket pocket of every soldier's uniform. The kit usually contained 2 gauze dressings that were designed to stop the bleeding, one for entrance wound and one for the exit. If the soldier was lucky, this would keep him alive long enough for the stretcher bearer to reach him. The stretcher bearer would have a larger first aid kit with bigger dressings for treating shrapnel wounds. Once back in the trenches, the soldier would be given shots against tetanus, and other infections, and was treated to prevent shock and further blood loss.
As the great empires of Europe went to war, so did their colonies throughout the globe. France brought Zouaves from Africa to Flanders. Britain brought in Canadians, South Africans, Anzacs, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and Gurkhas from India. In Africa, German colonial troops, the Schutztruppe, fought for their existence against Belgian, British, French and Portuguese attackers. Russia brought troops from Siberia to Europe. The Chinese Labour Corps worked behind the lines on the Western Front, and war flared throughout the Middle East. Millions of men from every corner of the globe fought in what was truly the First World War.
And this is very similar to World War II. They're called World Wars for a reason. They weren't isolated to simply the Middle East and Europe. It was all over the world. Men from all over came to fight for their countries, came to fight for what they believed in. Alright. Over 100,000 pigeons served in the war, carrying messages between the front lines and command headquarters. Their ability to reach high altitudes with great speed, combined with their natural homing instinct, made them instrumental to the war effort. Communication lines could be broken, telephone lines cut or buried, and flag and light signals were often proved inadequate. Pigeons, on the other hand, were hard to shoot down even for the best marksmen. They were also sent from inside planes or tanks and were vital for emergency communication. With a mission success rate of over 90%, they were so important that in Great Britain, the shooting of a homing pigeon was punishable by 6 months in jail. One famous pigeon was Cher-Ami, a blue checked hen that was sent out by ambushed American soldiers, the Lost Battalion. Trapped deep behind enemy lines, they were not only surrounded by enemy soldiers, their own artillery began firing on them. Without any working radios, they sent out Cher-Ami to carry the short message. We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. The bird flew to divisional headquarters 25 miles to the rear in under 25 minutes. She arrived bleeding from the chest with a broken leg and blind in one eye, but the message received and the Lost Battalion was saved. They also had natural camouflage, as many pigeons used in the war were completely white. It would made them hard to see in the sky. The war saw a large amount of motorization and modern mechanization, but it was still mainly run by horsepower. Field guns, howitzers, and mortars were still towed by teams of horses, while mules and donkeys carried water, food, and ammunition. Camels carried wounded soldiers to the hot desert or charged in a battle. Tens of thousands of dogs carried messages, dragged carts laden with supplies, brought medical help to the wounded. Slugs warned soldiers of incoming gas attacks. Cats would hunt rats and other vermin in the trenches, and Dobermans stood guard outside of tents and bunkers. Smaller dogs carried telephone wires or communication equipment through no man's land. Pigeons were highly valued as messengers in the field, and were even sent out of flying planes or moving tanks to carry important messages back to command posts. When communication devices broke down or telephone lines were cut, the pigeon's instincts would still reliably guide them towards their destination. The war also saw many mascots, and it wasn't all that unusual to see a lion cub, a monkey, or even a small kangaroo following the soldiers into the trenches.
The importance of the Suez Canal to the British in the war cannot be overstated. Having millions of troops from India, Australia and New Zealand heading to Egypt and Europe, and also British oil from Persia being shipped through the canal, it was a vital supply line. If captured by the Ottoman Empire, it would severely disrupt British troop and supply routes and put the entire Eastern Mediterranean in Ottoman hands. In early 1915, they crossed the Sinai Desert to attack the canal. This near impossible accomplishment was enabled by German engineers going in advance to dig water wells through the desert. When the Ottomans reached the canal, they knew they only had 4 days to seize it before running out of supplies. Ottoman artillery would be vital for the attack to have any chance of success, and diversionary attacks all along the canal would be launched in the hopes of confusing the defenders. The Ottomans would attack the Suez Canal several times during the war, but never took it. The British counterattacked and pushed the Ottomans back into the Sinai Desert. With Russia out of the war, Germany was free to transfer hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened troops to the Western Front to try to break the stalemate there and hope to win the war through a decisive final victory. The Americans had not yet arrived in force, and the British and French were exhausted from the battles of 1917. It was time to strike. Operation Michael would be the first battle of the new offensive. The plan was to punch through the British Fifth Army and outflank the Third near the endless, devastated no-man's land of St. Quentin, with the aim of finally capturing the vital Allied railway hub of Amiens. This was to be the mother of all battles. It began with 1 million artillery shells raining down on the British in 5 hours. Headquarters, communications and artillery were destroyed. Following the surprise and terror, German stormtroopers overwhelmed the British defences, ripping a gap over 60 kilometers long in their lines. This was only the beginning of the Kaiserschlacht.
Or Kaiser's Battle. People tend to doubt the French. Well, the fortress of Vaux endangered the German left flank as their infantry advanced on Verdun, and German high command ordered it taken at all costs. But the 600-man fort garrison under Major Sylvain Eugene Renaud would sell their lives dearly. With machine gun fire from counterscarped galleries, they defended the entrance to the fort, inflicting heavy casualties on the German attackers. The Germans couldn't stay out in the open under the merciless French artillery, so they had to force their way into the fort's subterranean levels. Engineers breached the heavy steel doors with grenade bundles and flamethrowers spewed into the dark, narrow corridors ahead. The defenders barricaded themselves behind sandbags, and for nearly 5 days, French grenadiers and machine gunners held their own in vicious close combat fighting. Smoke, gas, and fumes made sleeping impossible. Forced soldiers fight in total darkness between the dead bodies in the narrow corridors. As attempts to relieve the fort from outside failed, the situation grew grimmer by the hour, and the French defenders began to die of thirst and sickness. After his final carrier pigeon failed to bring relief, Mayor Reynolds surrendered to the German forces. The main target for the German army during the Battle of Verdun was not to capture the city itself, but the line of heights near the river Meuse known as the Côtes de Meuse. Since antiquity, those heights had been a strategic stronghold, dominating the whole region. The Germans were initially able to cross the Meuse and drive the French out of their positions on the west bank, even advancing so far as capturing Fort Douaumont. But the battle for the heights further north soon became a living nightmare for the troops on both sides. Camouflaged machine gun nests and relentless shell fire from French 75mm field guns tore deep holes into the advancing German infantry columns, at the same time as German flamethrower units and heavy howitzers smashed into the fortified French positions. Hills like Côte 304 and Mortagne, the Dead Man's Hill, became lasting synonyms for the truly unbelievable slaughter there, as the Germans tried to wrestle the heights from the French defenders by sheer force. Only after a 36-hour bombardment from 500 artillery guns, 9th of April 1916, were the Germans able to rout the broken French lines and take the two hills. The fighting on the hilltops was perhaps the worst of the entire war, with soldiers dying of thirst and the wounded drowning in mud.
Maria Boczkarova had been a soldier since 1914, after personally petitioning the Tsar to be allowed to fight, as women were not allowed to officially join the Imperial Russian Army. Then, in 1917, when the February Revolution began to tear that army apart, and many war-weary men simply deserted, the now decorated war hero Boczkarova sent a request to the Minister of War, Alexander Kerensky, to form the first Women's Battalion of Death. While Kerensky saw the strong propagandistic potential of the patriotic death battalions, Boczkarova was determined to create a viable fighting force, equal to those of men and exemplary in their willingness to die for Russia. Of the 2,000 women who initially volunteered, only 300 completed Boczkarova's tough training regime. Her battalion occupied active frontline trenches and went over the top during the Kerensky offensive in July 1917. They fought well, but suffered heavy losses. Boczkarova herself was wounded by shell fire. Other battalions were formed after this, but recruits were often discouraged by the constant hostility of men at the front, many of whom looked down on them simply for being women. Others saw them as tools of the war ministry, and by the end of the year and the October Revolution, they had been dissolved. An estimated 5,000 women in total served in these units, though only Bochkarovas saw frontline action in the First World War. In December 1915, the Allies held the Second Chantilly Conference and agreed that all their armies on different fronts should coordinate their attacks on the Central Powers to hinder them from sending reserves from one front to another. In accordance with the Chantilly Agreement, the Russian commander of the southwestern front of the Imperial Russian Army, General Alexei Brusilov, planned a massive offensive against the Austro-Hungarians in Galicia for the summer of 1916. The aim of Brusilov's offensive was to ease the pressure on the Allied armies in France and Italy, and hopefully force Austria-Hungary out of the war. Germany's furious attack on the Verdun Heights in February 1916 took the French by surprise, and the hellish fighting soon consumed the bulk of the French army. Marshal Joffre requested that the Russians hasten their plans to the east to draw German forces away from Verdun, and on June 4th, Brusilov attacked along a 250-mile front in Galicia. Using revolutionary artillery and shock troop tactics, the Russians broke through the Austro-Hungarian defenses and secured more ground than any other offensive of the war, but at a tremendous loss of lives on both sides. As planned, Germany was forced to transfer substantial resources from Verdun to counter the Russians, aiding the French defense. Austria-Hungary too had to pull troops from the Italian front, but the Brusilov offensive had severely crippled the dual monarchy for the rest of the war. The first major Ottoman battle of the war, the Battle of Sarıkamış against the Russians in January 1915, resulted in catastrophe for the Ottomans, and afterward the British thought that taking Constantinople and knocking the Ottomans out of the war would be an easy task. So easy, in fact, that the 1915 Dardanelles operation was referred to as a cruise through the Sea of Marmara. But that offensive, Gallipoli, failed, as the British army was stymied again and again until the attacks were finally called off after 8 months and casualties in the hundreds of thousands. When, just a few short months later, the British surrendered an entire army to the Ottomans at Kut al-Amara on the Tigris River, the British army, the nation, and even Winston Churchill, the initial impetus behind the Dardanelles operation, knew that the Ottoman Empire was anything but a pushover, and that they were a formidable enemy armed with modern weaponry. Churchill received heavy criticism for his role in the Dardanelles operation, and left his post as First Lord of the Admiralty for the Western Front to lead a battalion there. But the two military failures were a real blow to British morale in general, and High Command realized that hubris does not win battles in modern war. Ottoman morale, on the other hand, soared as the Empire rallied around Mustafa Kemal, the new national hero after his leadership at Gallipoli, who would one day be known as Ataturk, the founder and first president of Turkey. The British would, however, learn from their mistakes, and 1917 and 1918 would see great British successes in the Middle East. The German unrestricted submarine warfare campaign had raised serious concerns in British High Command. 12 British and French divisions were gathered that summer to attack the German Fourth Army near the small Belgian village of Passchendaele, to break through and force the Germans to abandon their submarine bases on the Belgian coast. The Battle of Passchendaele, also known as the Third Battle of Ypres, began on July 31st, 1917, with an artillery barrage of over 4 million shells, which not only obliterated the German forward defenses, but also destroyed the drainage system of the whole region. The initial infantry attacks took the remnants of the front lines from the stunned defenders with relative ease, but the German army was now fighting in a multi-layered flexible defense grid, consisting of mutually supporting strongpoints and shell-proof pillboxes that withstood large breakthrough attempts. Specially trained German counterattack troops engaged the British and prevented any real advance. General Herbert Plumer answered with small, locally confined bite-and-hold attacks, which efficiently focused on capturing and destroying the German strongpoints. However, The autumn rain soon turned the blasted battlefield into a sodden, muddy swamp, in which men and horses could sink, never to surface again. Like the Somme, this battle deteriorated into a horrifically bloody battle of attrition. And, again like the Somme, it was the impeding winter that ended the struggle, shortly after the British capture of the decimated village of Passchendaele.
The art of flying airplanes was only a decade old as the war began. There were no established instructions for the first fighter pilots, so they had to simply learn flying by flying. Pilot training was often as dangerous as flying in combat. All the warring nations had specialized training schools for their air squadrons by 1916, and lessons on how to climb more quickly in the air or how to do spiral turns of more than 45 degrees became standard. However, there was no substitute for experience. Many young pilots did not survive the first encounter with an enemy who may have had hundreds of hours of flight experience.
It was initially planned as a joint Franco-British attack to deny the German army the initiative on the Western Front. But as 1916 unfolded, British Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig needed to take some pressure off the French army as they tried to stem the German tide at Verdun. A new attack in unison with Allied offensives on the Eastern and Italian fronts could thwart the Central Powers' ability to relocate reserves between their fronts and eventually lead to a decisive breakthrough. For the Western Front attack, 13 British and 5 French divisions were chosen to attack the German Second Army on both sides of the River Somme. The vicious preliminary bombardment on June 24th by 1,500 heavy guns and howitzers was supposed to destroy the German positions entirely, but many shells were ineffective in the muddy terrain and failed to cut the German barbed wire. As the British and French soldiers went over the top on July 1st, the German defenders rose from their dugouts and brought their guns to bear. While the French assault south of the river took the Germans off guard, the British in the north were held up by fortified bunkers and barbed wire and took tremendous casualties from alert defenders. Heavy fighting for the smallest amount of ground in multiple renewed offensives forced the Germans to transfer reinforcements from Verdun to the Somme. But the Somme became a bloody battle of attrition. And though the newly constructed Mark I tanks were sent into battle to tip the scales and had great shock value, they were extremely unreliable and unable to make a difference. Winter ended the struggle on November 18th, with the Entente gaining 12 kilometers of ground for over 600,000 casualties.
By 1917, London had already experienced the danger of Zeppelin bombing runs for 2 years, but now the fearsome heavy Gotha bombers appeared in the skies. Outfitted with additional fuel tanks and able to transport as much as 330 pounds of conventional and incendiary bombs to southern England, they were tasked with not only destroying vital parts of British war industry, but also exhausting the British will to fight. Population were initially shocked and sent for the first time many children to the safety of the countryside. But soon the British Air Defence and the Royal Flying Corps were up to the task of defending their homeland. Thomas Edward Lawrence was sent to Palestine by the British Foreign Office before the war, where he studied the customs and the culture of the Near East. In December 1914, he was assigned to Cairo as the British Army secured the Suez Canal, along with the constant threat of an Ottoman offensive in the region. His job was to create a survey of the Palestinian countryside and to collect maps for the war in the Middle East. He also supervised the encoding and decoding of telegrams that were sent between Athens, Gallipoli, Petrograd, and Cairo. Soon he became involved in secret negotiations with the rebellious Bedouins, and provided British guns and gold to the rebels. Lawrence later became a personal friend and advisor of Faisal, the son of Hussein bin Ali, the leader of the Arab rebel. The British officer exchanged his khaki dress for the traditional garb of the Arabs. He accompanied the rebels throughout the war during their attacks on Ottoman outposts and the Hejaz Railway. Disillusioned by the backdoor politics of his own government, Lawrence departed the Middle East shortly after the revolt captured Damascus. His story was romanticized by the press of the day, granting him celebrity status that he later sought to evade. Lawrence is a figure shrouded in controversy. Some accuse him of being a British spy on a mission to raise an army for British interests. Others believe he genuinely cared for the Arab people and point to his involvement in the region before the war, and his efforts to aid Arabs in the peace talks after the war. His unexpected death at the age of only 46 only increased his mystique. There is much that will never be known about the man, but his legend endures. Propelled by illuminating gas or simply hot air, observation balloons were the extended eyes of the Army. The ability to ascend up to 1,500 meters, or 4,000 feet, they gave the balloonists the ability to spot enemy movements as well as the muzzle flashes from their distant batteries. They would pass down their observations via flags or wireless radio signals, alerting officers to changes on the battlefield. Sitting in a basket with only binoculars and a code book, the observer was in constant danger from enemy aircraft trying to shoot down the balloon by setting on fire with incendiary bullets or rockets. Only anti-aircraft guns and Allied fighter pilots were able to protect them, for parachutes were in their infancy. The Anzacs, or Australian New Zealand Army Corps, used improvised self-firing rifles during their evacuation from the Gallipoli Peninsula. One small tin filled with water dripped into another small empty tin that was attached to the trigger with a wire. Eventually, this would pull the trigger and fire the rifle, attached to several rifles with different timings. This would trick the Ottomans into thinking that the Anzacs were occupied. Still occupied their positions and made the retreat a safer affair. The deceit was a success. 80,000 men evacuated the area with only half a dozen casualties. The United States Congress passed the Selective Service Act in 1917 for all males aged 21 to 30, allowing African American men to serve in the U.S. Army. Many were eager to join the war effort, and only weeks after the USA declared war on Germany, the quota of soldiers was already filled. However, this does not mean that there was no discrimination or segregation within the Army. African Americans were not allowed to serve in the Marines or in higher positions in the Navy, though every other branch was theoretically open to them. There were only two regular combat divisions, the 92nd and the 93rd, that included African Americans among their ranks in 1917. They were soon deployed in the Western Front as the U.S. Army fought alongside the French Army in Meuse-Argonne in the Second Battle of the Marne. Time and time again they prevailed under heavy German fire, and as a result of the 369th Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters was often mentioned in dispatches. And if you don't know, regiments in the 300s were meant to be, it was more of a, sort of like a sick joke, because regiments in the 300s were like National Guard, they simply stayed at home. They stayed at home and didn't really do any fighting. So it was a bit of a joke. Men like Henry Lincoln Johnson, James Reese Europe, and Needham Roberts became celebrated figures. True to their motto, "Goddamn, let's go," they served nearly 200 days in the front lines and were the first U.S. unit to be awarded the Croix de Guerre, integrated into the French 161st Division. They were outfitted with French weapons and equipment, making the distinct look of the Adrian helmet one of their symbols. The 369th Regiment claimed that they were the first unit to cross the Rhine and into Germany itself. Speeding through the trenches in constant danger, they were the messengers of the Great War. Trench runners would deliver messages from one command post to another if communication lines were destroyed or if a unit was cut off. Often working in pairs, they memorized each trench route and every minute detail of their sections in order to move as quickly as possible. Runners would familiarize themselves with the trench systems to such a degree that they could lead new groups of soldiers safely through the maze of trenches and dugouts to the forward lines under cover of the night. To effectively do their jobs, they were trained in reconnaissance and encryption, were physically and mentally fit and reliable, and were able to use all means of communication, including pigeon handling.
The war had its origins in Europe, but while there was a lot of fighting within that continent, it was a global conflict from the beginning. At the start of the war, the Japanese Empire was already locking horns with Germany and China and the Pacific Islands. And when the Ottoman Empire, which stretched from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf, joined in late 1914, it truly became a world war. There were naval battles in the South Pacific and South Atlantic. Soldiers from every continent except Antarctica would fight. There were fronts in Persia, Mesopotamia, Libya, even the borders of India, and fighting all over Africa as European colonies changed hands. Towards the end of the war, the United States and Brazil would also join in the fighting. It was the first truly global war and the largest in history at the time.
In the years leading up to World War I, the tension between the European powers fueled suspicion that foreign agents could undermine national security. Most of the countries involved developed organizations dedicated to the gathering of the information on military secrets. The White Lady Network, based in Liège, Belgium, provided the Allies with information on German troop trains. Encrypted messages were sent by carrier pigeons across the lines. Spies also employed a range of techniques like invisible ink and cameras hidden in perfume bottles. A courtesan, I admit it. A spy, never. Not a Hari. France had a major spy scandal in 1917 when evidence of German payments to the anti-war movement in the country surfaced. Among those arrested was famous exotic dancer Mata Hari. Sharp, intelligent, and fluent in several languages, she denied any involvement. She was tried and executed on October 15th by a firing squad. Her deal is still debated and shrouded in mystery.
Germany, and especially Kaiser Wilhelm II, dreamed of a greater colonial empire and a greater German hegemony in the concert of Europe. A big concern for Germany was the expansion of the Russian railway system. In 1914, German Chancellor von Bethmann-Hollweg stated that within 3 years, Russia would be able to mobilize troops so quickly that the German advantage in technology would not be able to overcome the Russian advantage in manpower. To win the war, they had to act quickly. What Germany feared was a war on two fronts, so their battle plan was to defeat France and then focus the entire German military might on the Russian Empire.
So basically what that means is that Germany didn't really have the power to do a whole divide and conquer.
Italy had been an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war. But when it broke out in 1914, they claimed that the alliance was only a defensive one, and Italy had no obligation to join an offensive war. However, 1 year later, Italy joined the war siding with the Allies, hoping to reclaim lost Italian lands that were now part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Italian front was characterized by mountains. The amount of soldiers wounded compared to killed was far greater there than other fronts, because stray bullets would splinter the rock into deadly projectiles that were particularly dangerous to eyes and faces. Although the 600-year-old Ottoman Empire was huge, stretching from the Balkans to the Persian Gulf, it was in decay and had lost wars to both Italy and a Balkan alliance in the years preceding the First World War. However, the Ottoman Empire would still prove to be a formidable opponent, with the Young Turks movement and the institution of a constitutional government having paved the way for modernization in all aspects of life, including the military. Minister of War Enver Pasha, one of the three Pashas who basically ran the empire during the war, dreamed of a modern Turkish nation that did not look to the Arab world for guidance, but looked to itself. His dream would one day come true, but he would not live to see it. As the most multicultural of all the great empires, Austria-Hungary had 15 different language versions of its national anthem. While its internal workings, that often valued heritage over ability, left it somewhat in a state of decay by 1914, the empire still dreamed of expanding its influence throughout the Balkans and perhaps one day all the way to Persia. In 1908, Austria-Hungary had annexed Bosnia, making Serbia the next in line. And if Serbia fell, Russia would lose all influence in the Balkan region. In 1914, a quarter of the world was controlled by the British Empire, and the colonies were secured by Britain's supreme naval power. At the time, the British Army was quite small compared to the other European powers, but it was the only fully professional regular army in Europe, and the soldiers were highly efficient despite their small numbers. Fearing the expansion of German influence, Britain guaranteed Belgium's neutrality, meaning that an attack on Belgium was an attack on Britain, and all the corners of the global empire would join the fight. At the outbreak of the war, the Russian Empire was able to mobilize nearly 5 million men in 115 infantry divisions and 38 cavalry divisions. The infantry was equipped with a Wintowka Moisină version of the 7.62mm bolt-action rifle, Moisină Nagant 1891. And each infantry regiment, clad in modern green khaki uniforms, fielded 8 belt-fed and water-cooled Maxim M1910 machine guns and was supported by the Putilov 76.2mm field gun. Alongside them fought the Lancers, Dragoons, Hussars and Cossacks, all with long, glorious military traditions of service. Airplanes and armored car divisions had the ability to quickly alter the dynamic of the battlefield, and Russia had 2 great advantages, land and men. There were, however, doubts that Russia's military was ready to fight a modern war. With a population of nearly 170 million people, the Russian Empire could call upon more soldiers than any other European nation. But coming from mostly agrarian, deeply religious and often superstitious societies, the regular Russian conscript got little more than a rudimentary training of basic soldier skills. The high illiteracy rate made broad communications difficult, and this also affected complex tactical decisions. The General Staff and Officer Corps suffered from internal political scheming, mistrust and personal jealousies between commanders, and rampant nepotism stood in the way of tactical innovation. Also, the belief that the bayonet was mightier than a bullet made soldiers' lives expendable and casualties acceptable. Still, though Russia would suffer catastrophic defeats, Tannenberg, Masurian Lakes, she would also achieve glorious victories, like the Brusilov offensive, which nearly knocked Austria-Hungary out of the war. Also, Russia could give up endless amounts of land, drawing the enemy further and further from his supplies and reserves, leaving it open to a counterstrike. It was a mighty army indeed.
Mighty army just had problems.
By 1910, the United States had become the world's leading industrial power. Though they remained neutral for the first few years of the war, American industry and finance played a major role. Initially, American reaction to the war was mixed. While the greatest number of immigrants in the States were from Britain, including Ireland, Germans were second, and there was sympathy for both sides. However, when the war began, Britain cut Germany's transatlantic cable, so all American reports of the war were routed through Britain, and only what was favorable passed the censors. Also, events like the sinking of the ocean liner Lusitania and the execution of Edith Cavell inflamed the American public, and the war with Germany soon loomed large.
Also, I forgot to mention I never heard anyone pronounce it as Moisin Nagant. Doesn't make much sense to me, personally. The French spirit, the élan vital of heroism on the battlefield, accompanied the mass infantry charge into the German advance in August of 1914, but it was only the steadfast defense of the Marne that saved Paris. For many, that miracle spoke of French determination to withstand even the greatest foe, even after that foe had his boots buried deep into French soil. It became a battle for survival for its defenders as the German armies threatened the national symbol of Verdun, while the British always had the opinion of withdrawing to their island. For the French, soldier and civilian alike, it was a war for their homes and their soil, accompanied and destroyed by their arch-enemies. So the French fielded more men than their allies. They suffered greater casualties. They pioneered tactics like the Cuban barrage. They fielded mighty tanks and the first true air force. And by the end of the war, it was a Frenchman who commanded the Allied forces.
British Royal Marines were traditionally light infantry that accompanied the Royal Navy into the conflict zones of the Empire. The Marines were Navy sailors, whose mission it was to provide the first landing party or secure beachheads during amphibious operations. Their uniform was navy blue with splashes of khaki. They were allowed to grow beards, and they only received naval pay for a long time, which was less than army pay. In August 1914, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, wanted the inclusion of surplus naval personnel and light artillery into the Royal Marines Reserves to create the 63rd Royal Naval Division. The division first supported the British forces at Antwerp, and later fought at the battles of Gallipoli, the Somme, and Passchendaele.
A little fact, early in the war, it was actually mandatory for British soldiers to grow mustaches. But when chemical attacks started becoming more common, and soldiers had to start wearing face masks, it was found that the facial hair created gaps between the mask and the face, letting gas into the mask. So it became standard for British soldiers and actually soldiers all over the world to be clean shaven. Emerging from a small rural village in central Russia, Grigory Y. Rasputin rose to prominence as a wandering religious mystic, who offered his teachings in exchange for hospitality during his journeys and pilgrimages to various religious sites. In 1903, he attracted the attention of the Tsarina Alexandra in St. Petersburg. She was desperate to find a cure for the royal heir Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia, which I believe is liquid in the lungs. Alexandria turned to the seemingly miraculous powers of Rasputin, who succeeded in stopping a bout of bleeding. Following his success, he not only became Alexei's official doctor, but quickly climbed the social ladder and extended his influence over the royal court. He built his own political circle and court favorites, and warned the Tsar that Russia's involvement in the war would inevitably lead to the downfall of his dynasty. Many royal and political figures despised Rasputin's influence over the Tsar and Tsarina, and his impudent, debaucherous lifestyle, and he was assassinated December 30th, 1916. I believe he also had a tendency to not die.
As the great empires of Europe went to war...
Oh, we've already seen that. Let's see. I want to see if there's just one more I can do. The Imperial German Army needed a compact and effective weapon for fighting in the trenches. The result was the MP-18, or Maschinen Pistol 1918, developed during 1917. The weapon was produced in large quantities and used by the German stormtroopers. It was considered the world's first practical submachine gun and would set the standard for many future designs. After the war, the MP-18, well, after the Treaty of Versailles, basically screwed over, well, not the Treaty of Versailles, the armistice basically cut Germany's military down, and many MP-18s ended up being used by police forces. Everyone's favorite weapon. Although production of the Martini-Henry rifle ended in 1889, it remained in service throughout the British Empire until the end of World War I, but was even seen in use in Afghanistan well into the 21st century. It was a breech-loading, single-shot weapon firing a heavy black powder cartridge, which caused horrific damage. In World War I, the Martini-Henry was primarily fielded as a reserve rifle, but in the earlier stages of the war, it was used in aircraft as an anti-balloon weapon together with newly developed incendiary ammunition. The Martini Henry was also issued to colonial troops in the African and Middle Eastern theaters of World War I. Lever-action rifles are usually associated with the Wild West, but in World War I, one model of lever-action rifle was used successfully by Russia. At the outset of the war, the Russian Empire was desperately short of its Mosin Nagant service rifle for its millions of troops, leading to the Russians going around the world to purchase any additional suitable weapons they could get. One of the rifles that caught their attention was the American M1895 lever-action sporting rifle, used by Theodore Roosevelt for safari hunting. The American manufacturer got an order for 300,000 rifles modified for Russian military use, including the addition of a bayonet lug, a box magazine accepting Mosin Nagant stripper clips, and rechambering for Russian smokeless rifle ammunition, most likely being the 7.62 millimeter Soviet bullet, which is still in use today mainly in the AK series of rifles. But this modified model was designated the Model 1915. It saw a lot of action where it performed well. So yeah, the Russian 1895 is actually just a modified American rifle. The Austrian Gewehr M95 is unusual in featuring a straight pull bolt action, allowing its action to be operated by simply pulling the bolt handle straight back and forth. This makes the M95 one of the fastest firing bolt action rifles, and also led to the nickname Ruckzuck. I don't speak German, meaning back and forth in German. It was a standard infantry rifle of the Austro-Hungarian army from 1895 until the fall of the empire in 1918. The M95 was also used in large numbers by Bulgaria, and its action was copied almost exactly for the infamous Canadian M1905 Ross straight pull bolt-action rifle. As was the case with most straight-pull rifles, the M95 was more sensitive to mud and dirt, but still had a reputation of reliability if handled with some care. One of the most famous variants of the M95 was a short rifle Stutzen, which was primarily used by stormtroopers. And the M95 was also used as a sniper rifle with telescopic sights. Some unusual equipment for the M95 were models 1916 luminous night sights and a wire destroyer, allowed a rifleman to grab and shoot through barbed wire. Since the straight pull action was a simple movement, it is well suited for semi-automatic conversions. During World War I, both Russia and Bulgaria experimented with such conversions by fitting gas tubes and pistons on the side of the Austrian straight-pull rifles. The Austrian Gasser M1870 revolver was adapted as a standard sidearm for the Austro-Hungarian cavalry in 1870 and was the first in a line of Gasser models produced until 1918. The M1870 chambered a large 11.25mm centerfire cartridge in a 6-round cylinder that was a gate loaded from the sight. The only more powerful revolver cartridge at the time was the American 45. A noticeable design feature of the Gasser M1870 is its use of an open frame with no bridge above the cylinder. It was a double-action revolver, meaning the hammer was first cocked and then released on the pull of the trigger. So the shooter did not have to manually cock the hammer before each shot. At the time of introduction of the M1870, it was one of the largest and heaviest revolvers on the market. By World War I, the Gasser M1870 was outdated, but due to its great stopping power, it became popular among Austrian stormtroopers. Gewehr 98, which I believe is arguably the culmination of bolt-action rifle developments of the late 19th century. The Gewehr 98 was the German standard infantry rifle from 1895 to 1935, and one of the most famous weapons ever. At its introduction, it made the service rifles of many other nations obsolete and led to many competing designs, especially as they came up against the excellent performance of the CG98 in various conflicts at the turn of the century. In 1908, the shortened Carabiner 98 AZ was approved and issued to cavalry and other armed branches that needed a more compact weapon. The 98 AZ would later be used by German stormtroopers since it was better suited for trench warfare. The Gewehr 98, or version of it, saw service with a multitude of nations, including the Ottoman Empire, Spain, and Sweden. The later Carabiner 98K was closely based on the G98 and was the main German rifle throughout the next World War. So yeah, this is the father of the Kar 98K. And we'll end this with an American weapon. Perhaps the most legendary US rifle ever is the O3, or the M1903 rifle. It was the mainstay American service rifle for over 30 years, till the option of the M1, Garand, but went on to see action even in the Vietnam War. The rifle that preceded the M1903, the Krag Jorgensen, was used in the Spanish-American War and was considered inferior to the modern clip-loaded bolt-action rifle of German design that the Spanish used. This led to the pursuit of a more comparable rifle, which is found in the M1903. In fact, used in action so similar to German rifles that the German manufacturer sued in court and won, receiving royalties. During World War I, many different versions of the M1903 were developed, including the Mark I, which allowed the semi-automatic Pedersen device to be fitted to the rifle, and the stripped air service 03 with extended 25-round magazine. Alright. Well, that was a lot. Thanks for watching, and, well, see ya.